If it's private, then it's not subject to their approval. They can only approve if you are dealing, if it's a public offer. So that is our point. They don't need to approve. And Julia, let me take a step back and put something to context before we come to approval. Capital markets, by definition, don't have to be all regulated. That's why there's something called private equity. It is not regulated. If you look at a well-functioning economy, if you look at more developed economies, businesses rely on banks for 40% of their funding, and they rely on capital markets for 60% of their funding. Capital markets is the leading market for financing. So that's why things like Wall Street are big movers in more developed economies. However, if you come back to Kenya, banking markets account for 99% of business funding, with capital markets only accounting for 1%. Now, that explains why businesses now have to be, there's bank dominance. Businesses have to rely on banks for essentially all their funding, but banks will only fund you if you already have some equity capital. They'll want you to have the first layer of capital has to be equity, and then they'll give you bank debt. Now, people don't have that first layer of capital like ourselves. There's no way we could have raised the kind of money we've raised, 20 billion shillings, just by going to a bank. They would have said, you need to have some assets. Now, once they say you need to have some assets, in other words, they're saying you need to be an established player. You need to be a wealthy individual. Ideas alone are not sufficient to get funding. Now, if you are in a more developed market, you won't have to be restrained to banks. You can go to capital markets with your ideas and you'll get funding. Our own regulations recognize that, and they say, once you get to the capital markets, you will find regulated markets and you'll also find private markets. Our own regulations recognize that private markets are essential to capital markets growth. So the moment you meet any of this, if you're going to deal with only 100 persons, if you're only going to deal with select individuals, if you're going to deal with a club, our own regulations then say it is not subject to CMA approval. So yes, they didn't approve the product, but the most important thing, the product is not subject to their approval because it's not a public offering. And then there's a perception that the numbers does make the offering public. Now, our own regulations say any of the 9. But when you now go to litigation, this issue has been litigated before in more developed markets. And what the judges have said, what matters is the manner of offering. Even if I sell to one person, but I sell it in a public manner, that means I go put it on a billboard. That becomes a public offering. If I sell it to 1 million people, but I went approaching individuals such as Julian, that is a private offering regardless of the numbers. So
we were simply guiding Cytonn on the available opportunities, because they could do a public offer, they will do a private placement, they will do many other products, but it is not really an approval, go and do this in the market.